Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the wonderfully boring but oddly fascinating world of ancient Chinese taxes. Imagine this, you're walking through a dusty market street in Tang Dynasty China. The scent of sizzling pork buns lingers in the air. Vendors shout about silk lacquerware and dried fish. And somewhere in the background, a bureaucrat is quietly making a list of everything taxable you just looked at. Your beard taxed. Your tea taxed. That open window in your apartment, you guessed it, taxed. It sounds absurd, but taxation was more than just annoying paperwork. It was a deeply woven part of how emperors ruled, how dynasties thrived or crumbled, and how everyday people like you tiptoed their way through financial survival. You probably won't survive this world without a receipt scroll tucked into your robe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a dusty coastal trail somewhere near the old city of Hangzhou. The breeze is thick with the smell of salt, and not just the ocean kind. Salt is everywhere in baskets, in chunks, even in bricks, stamped with official seals. And all of it belongs to the government. Because in ancient China, salt was power. And power was always taxable. You stop at a small shop where a weathered man scoops out measured grains of salt with a carved wooden spoon. He weighs it, nods, then scribbles something on a bamboo tally. That tally isn't for you, it's for the tax office. Because even that tiny scoop is watched by the state. Salt was considered white gold. It preserved food before refrigeration, balanced the body's qi in traditional medicine, and flavored otherwise bland rice dishes. But for the emperors, it was a dream tax item. Hard to make, easy to control, and nearly impossible to avoid. By the Tang Dynasty, the government monopolized salt entirely. Private production was illegal, and anyone caught doing it risked severe punishment like exile, or worse, being drafted into a lifetime of canal labor. Sounds relaxing, right? The monopoly worked like this. The state owned the salt fields and sold salt to merchants at fixed prices. Prices that already included a hefty tax. These merchants then sold to the public, passing the tax along. This way, tax collection was cleverly baked into the transaction itself. No invoices, no fuss. Just inflated prices and government profit. You duck into a tea house and sip something savory and bitter. The owner leans in and says, "It's the salt tax, not the leaves, that's ruining us." You nod and look at the salt tray near the kitchen. It's chained to the wall. Historians still argue whether the salt tax was truly efficient or simply oppressive. On one hand, it provided nearly half the state's revenue at certain points. On the other, it bred massive corruption. Salt smugglers became legendary. Entire towns revolved around the black market. One imperial minister even noted that more salt leaked from the system than flowed through it. And while you might imagine tax collectors as stiff-robed bureaucrats, many were salt officers in armored boats, patrolling rivers for contraband, like pirates in the emperor's name. Your sleepy row down the Yangtze might suddenly be interrupted by a flashing paddle and a shouted demand, "Show us your salt." But here's the fringe tidbit. Some local villagers developed a strange method of protest. They began ritualizing salt evasion into annual festivals. People would gather, chant silly rhymes about invisible salt, and pretend to eat with invisible utensils. It was absurd performance art meets tax resistance. You can almost see the confused tax official taking notes. Later dynasties took the monopoly even further, with the Ming dynasty turning salt rights into a form of bureaucratic currency. Instead of being paid in coin, officials were granted the right to sell salt on a privilege that could make or break entire careers. And you just trying to season your tofu, well, you're now part of a 1,000-year-old revenue machine. The price of flavor is the price of empire. You set down your salted tofu and lift a steaming cup of tea. It's earthy, calming, and precisely the kind of moment ancient Chinese officials learned to monetize. Because if salt was the white gold of survival, tea was the liquid gold of culture, and that made it ripe for taxation. Your fingers wrap around the ceramic cup as you imagine yourself in the Tang dynasty, again, sipping tea, not just for taste, but to show refinement, education, even moral character. In a society where scholars sipped while reciting poetry and monks brewed leaves for meditation tea, wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual, a statement, a taxable habit. The government noticed. As early as the 8th century, imperial administrators began levying taxes on tea, at first lightly, and then as demand exploded heavily. By the time of the Song dynasty, tea taxes were feeding armies and building canals. The state regulated who could grow tea, who could sell it, and even where it could be brewed. You couldn't legally start a tea house without paying a licensing fee, and no, that license didn't come with free refills. Here's where it gets quirky. Some dynasties issued official tea cakes, pressed bricks of tea, wrapped in imperial seals. These doubled as both currency and a kind of taxation tool. If you had a tea cake, you were either well off or well watched. Trying to use unmarked leaves, that was contraband. Welcome to the leafy underworld. You wander through at a misty hillside plantation in Yunnan, watching rows of workers pluck delicate buds into woven baskets. Each kilo harvested brings a silent shadow behind it, a tax burden carried from leaf to cup. A single basket might mean an entire day's labor and still not be enough to meet the quota demanded by tax inspectors. And speaking of inspectors, they weren't just bean counters. In some provinces, tax officers were embedded directly into tea-growing regions, living among farmers and keeping meticulous ledgers. Imagine having a bureaucrat assigned to your backyard, tallying every leaf you touch. Cozy. Historians still argue whether the tea tax helped unify trade or simply centralized power in a way that stifled innovation. Some claim it standardized quality and helped popularize tea across East Asia. Others believe it merely gave elites another excuse to squeeze the countryside dry, one steep at a time. You crouch beside a campfire with a merchant who whispers of tea, smugglers, and secret midnight shipments. Entire villages were known to disguise tea leaves as medicine incense, even clothing padding, anything to dodge taxation. One smuggler's trick, hollowed out walking sticks filled with compressed oolong. Talk about traveling light. Later emperors, like those in the Qing dynasty, turned tea into diplomatic currency. Tributes of rare tea varieties were shipped to Mongol warlords, Tibetan rulers, and even Russian tsars. And guess what? These tributes came from heavily taxed harvests back home, meaning peasant farmers effectively funded foreign policy through the leaves they couldn't afford to keep. There's even a curious fringe record from a rural scroll noting a farmer fined not for selling untaxed tea, but for serving untaxed tea to his guests. That's right, entertaining friends could be a taxable offense. Next time you have people over, maybe check their tea receipts. You walk back through that quiet street in Hangzhou. Tea houses hum with conversation, and inside each one a dozen tiny transactions are taking place, money leaves, taxes, stories. And you wonder as your eyelids grow heavier, how something so gentle could become so politically sharp. It's said that one Ming-era philosopher drank tea not just to awaken the mind, but to remind himself of the bitter taste of governance. Every cup, he wrote, holds the flavor of the emperor's ledger. So go ahead, sip. But remember, somewhere an ancient tax official is smiling into his inkstone. You glance into a bronze mirror and stroke your chin. There it is, your proud, bristling beard. It gives you dignity, wisdom, authority. Unfortunately, in parts of ancient China, it also gave you a higher tax bill. Yes, believe it or not, your facial hair once came with a fiscal consequence. During certain dynastic periods, most notably under eccentric local magistrates in smaller kingdoms and border regions, there are scattered records of a beard tax. The reasoning beards were seen as a sign of adulthood and thus taxable productivity. If you were grown enough to grow it, you were grown enough to pay. You passed through a town gate, plastered with public notices, rice prices, tax rules, and yes, a scroll listing grooming-based assessments. It reads like satire, but it's deadly serious. One account from the Northern Wei period describes a tax collector literally pulling men aside, inspecting their chins and categorizing them. Full beard highest tier, patchy moderate, clean-shaven, free to go, for now. Historians still argue whether this was truly systemic or just a bizarre local oddity. Some suggest it was a symbolic tax, less about revenue and more about control, like a reminder that even your body belonged to the state. Others think it started as a joke among officials and got wildly out of hand. Classic bureaucracy. But here's the strange twist: the beard tax may have backfired in unexpected ways. Men started shaving not for fashion or religion, but to dodge payment. Barbers became wildly profitable. Some even offered tax evasion specials that included a clean shave, a fake monk robe, and a tutorial on walking like someone too spiritually detached for taxation. You step into one of these old barber shops where sharpened knives gleam and incense smolders. The air is thick with secrets. The barber whispers, "Your beard isn't just hair, it's a liability." Quirky anecdote time: a document found in a Song-era village archive describes a local man who braided his beard into a small bun and claimed it was a tail, thus not facial hair. The magistrate fined him anyway, but the case was recorded with a margin note inventive. "Ridiculous. Approved. You head toward a quieter part of town where monks sweep temple courtyards. Some are bearded, some not." Religion complicated the beard issue. Taoists often grew long facial hair as a sign of natural harmony. Confucian scholars did too, to signal respectability. But Buddhist monks, they were mostly clean-shaven, which conveniently kept them tax-exempt under some beard-focused rules. You start to realize that in ancient China, even appearance had a price. Long sleeves were taxed in certain court halls. Tall hats in certain regions came with surcharges, but beards walked the tightrope between identity and income. Too proud and you'd pay for it. Too bare and your neighbors might judge your manhood. Still, many chose the razor. One satirical poem from the Qing era mocks a man who shaved daily to avoid taxes, but ended up being taxed for owning too many mirrors. Joke's on him, I guess. The fringe fact that seals this section: a rumored incident from the late Tang period, where a traveling tax inspector was ambushed by a group of angry villagers disguised as monks. They shaved his beard in public and declared him spiritually reborn, and therefore tax-exempt. He fled, reportedly traumatized, but fiscally forgiven. You reach your home finally and notice your reflection in the tea kettle. That chin. It's valuable, just not in the way you thought. You run your fingers across the stubble and think maybe it's time to go monk. You open a wooden shutter and peer out into the cool morning air. A breeze slips in along with the distant clatter of a noodle vendor setting up for the day. It's peaceful, fresh, free. Except nope. In some corners of imperial China, even this luxury of air and light came with a price. The government, ever creative at times, levied what you might call a window tax. You blink in disbelief, but yes, your access to sunlight was once officially monetized. You pull back and scan the house you're in. The walls are thick, the windows small, and now it makes a bit more sense. There's an economic logic carved into the very bricks. Window taxes weren't just arbitrary cruelty. They were designed to target wealth subtly. More windows meant a bigger home. More light meant more luxury. And that meant more tax. Historians still argue whether this was truly enforced across the empire or selectively applied in wealthy trade zones, like coastal ports or major silk hubs. But records from the Southern Song period hint at bureaucrats literally walking the streets with counting rods, peering up at buildings and noting window size number and even placement. 3 above shoulder height, 4 facing west, taxed as merchant class. It reads like something out of a surreal census. You climb a staircase in an old home in Suzhou. The windows get smaller the higher you go. Not for style, for savings. It was common practice to build narrow slatted windows or keep them far above eye level to minimize tax burdens. Want fresh air? Sorry, gonna cost you. And it didn't stop at glass or shutters. In some edicts, a light and ventilation fee applied to rooftop openings, chimney vents, and get this elaborate balcony lattice work. That intricate wood carving of a lotus flower on your upstairs window, beautiful, also taxable. Here's a quirky little detail to circumvent the window tax. Some homes used removable walls. Instead of adding a window, they just unhinged an entire panel. No window here, sir, just a flexible door. One Qing official's diary recounts the absurdity of inspecting a home that had 0 windows, but 5 sliding doors positioned exactly where windows would be. Ingenious, ridiculous, and totally legal technically. You rest in a narrow courtyard, shaded by stone and silence. The space is open to the sky, but shielded from the street. These courtyards were partly cultural, yes, but also practical. They offered light and airflow without triggering window-based taxes, a loophole built into architecture. And then there's the fringe debate. Some scholars claim this kind of tax came from European influence, possibly filtering in through trade relations. A few British colonies in Asia had similar levies, and it's unclear who inspired whom. Did China invent it first, or borrow the concept? The historical timeline is hazy. What's clear is that the idea stuck around long enough to affect building design well into the Qing era. You glance back out through the shutter and consider what it means to tax visibility. To put a price on openness. It's more than economics, it's psychology. Limit the size of a person's view, and you shape how they live. Want a better view of the garden? That'll be 1 silver tael. Hope it's worth it. By now, night falls again. You light a lamp, and its flicker throws shadows across the window panes. In the soft taxed light, the world outside becomes a luxury framed by policy. And you wonder how much does it cost really to just see clearly. You pull the shutter closed, and just like that, free darkness. You take a stroll through a sleepy neighborhood tucked behind an ancient city wall. The stone path beneath your feet is uneven, worn smooth by generations. On either side, modest homes lean into each other like old friends, their bricks stacked tightly deliberately. But there's a detail that stands out. Some houses are oddly narrow, some strangely tall, and some have no second floor at all despite having the space. You pause, squint, and realize this is no coincidence. These buildings are shaped not by taste or terrain, but by taxes. Welcome to the world of construction taxes, where every brick laid had the potential to lighten or fatten the emperor's purse. You knock on one of those doors and are welcomed by a grey-haired builder sipping warm rice wine. He invites you in, and as you duck under a low wooden beam, he laughs. "We built it short on purpose. 1 extra foot up, and you pay for it with your life savings." Turns out, under various Chinese dynasties, especially during the Ming and Qing periods, taxes were sometimes assessed based on a structure's height, width, and number of rooms. Add a floor, pay more. Extend a room, pay double. Carve dragons into your roof tiles. That's considered decorative opulence, triple taxed. Historians still argue whether the system was meant to control excess or simply exploit ambition. Some records suggest the state used construction taxes to suppress displays of wealth, especially among merchants and artisans who weren't part of the noble class. Others see it as just another creative stream of revenue during financially strained periods. But the effect was clear. People started building weird, stubby towers, inverted L-shaped houses, even underground rooms that weren't taxed because they didn't add height. You step into one of these sunken chambers, cool, damp, and totally legal. One official record from the late Song era tells of a homeowner who carved a 3-room residence sideways into a hill. When inspectors came by, they saw a single flat wall and assumed it was a shed. Ingenious, one of them reportedly said, but suspicious. You peek up at a tiled roof. It looks plain, deliberately so. That's no accident. Fancy tiles meant you were rich, which meant, say it with me, more taxes. So instead, people painted patterns on the inside of their roofs hidden from the street. From the outside, humble and drab. From the inside, luxury and secret. The ancient version of if you know, you know. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Some towns had secret builders' guilds that shared tax-dodging architectural tricks. They developed things like foldable staircases, illusion walls, and double floors where the upper level looked like storage but was really a hidden tea room. You can almost hear the creak of a false wall sliding open to reveal someone's cozy, tax-free reading nook. You wander through a half-finished construction site where laborers work under oil lamps hushed and careful. A supervisor mutters about beam placement not just for balance but to avoid reaching taxable ceiling height. We stay one thumb beneath the threshold, he says, raising his finger to the sky. Emperor doesn't pay for my mistakes. Later dynasties created exemptions for rural homes, but loopholes often closed as quickly as they opened. The government wasn't blind. They knew people were gaming the system. That's why some edicts began to tax not just size, but material. Clay walls were taxed less than stone. Timber was somewhere in the middle. If you built with rare woods, that was considered a flex. You'd better be ready to pay accordingly. And the fringe fact that still baffles scholars: in certain regions, officials taxed the echo of a room. That's right, if a clap or voice bounced more than once, your home was considered large with decorative acoustics and subject to premium rates. Try proving that in court. You step back outside and gaze at the houses lining the path. Their shapes now make sense. They are quiet rebellions in brick and beam testaments to a people who understood that to survive the empire, you had to outbuild it quite literally. And just like that, you begin to wonder, if a wall stands in silence and no one hears its tax echo, does it still owe? You're walking down a foggy alley at dawn, feet crunching over loose straw and broken tiles. The city is still asleep, or so it seems. Behind some shuttered doors, life is busy in a way that doesn't officially exist. No candles lit, no tax scrolls posted, just whispered trades, unrecorded names, and phantom houses. Because tonight you find yourself inside one of the strangest chapters of ancient Chinese taxation, the eerie world of ghost taxes, fees levied on things that didn't exist. At first it sounds like nonsense, taxing what's not real. But you pass a weary clerk hunched over a bamboo ledger, and his stylus scratches out property after property, some occupied, some abandoned, and some, well, invented. Ghost households, ghost farmlands, ghost people. Entire taxable entries floating in the imperial bureaucracy like unseen spirits. You peek over his shoulder. There's a record for a man named He Jin, who supposedly owns 3 homes and a granary in the countryside. But local villagers swear no such man ever lived there. The address A Bend in the River, where no buildings stand. And yet year after year, someone pays that tax. Or at least someone makes it seem like they do. Historians still argue whether these phantom entries were clerical errors or deliberate schemes. Some officials used them to pad their ledgers, reporting inflated household numbers to impress superiors and justify larger budgets. Others used them to embezzle, quietly collect taxes from real people, but attribute the payments to fake residents, pocketing the difference. The fringe tidbit in the Tang dynasty: one provincial governor allegedly claimed taxes from over 200 ghost residents. That's an entire village of the undead, economically speaking. And this wasn't limited to people. Entire fields that didn't exist were taxed. Forests that had long been burned down, still listed in the books. Riverboats that had sunk decades ago, still technically active and taxable. The imperial bureaucracy was so vast, so layered, that once something entered the system, it was nearly impossible to erase. You duck into a records office lit by the soft flicker of an oil lamp. A young scribe is muttering, eyes bleary, as he copies names from an older scroll. You hear him whisper, "I've written this man's name 10 times. And no one's ever seen him." But his job isn't to question. It's to record. In ink, the imaginary becomes real. To catch this fraud, emperors sometimes sent out shadow auditors. Officials disguised as travelers who investigated tax zones in secret. These undercover agents would visit random houses, ask about neighbors, and map out the village. If names didn't match, if houses weren't standing heads, would roll figuratively and sometimes literally. But here's where it gets creepier. In some places, villagers went along with the ruse. They'd create fake door signs, invent stories about imaginary relatives, even hold rituals for fictional ancestors just to make ghost entries seem authentic. You pass a crumbling shrine and spot a plaque with names so smudged they're unreadable. Locals claim it honors an invisible lineage, a clever euphemism for state-licensed fiction. You start to see the deeper game here. This wasn't just tax fraud, it was survival. For some communities, ghost entries provided just enough buffer to protect real lives. If a harsh winter hit, they could redirect taxes meant for fake fields and save actual food stores. If population quotas rose, they could assign burdens to the imaginary. Paper ghosts were shields. But there's a price. One chilling case from the early Qing period involves a small village that went too far. When a new magistrate arrived and began a surprise census, the locals panicked. They held a mock funeral for an entire phantom family to explain their absence. But someone slipped. A child mentioned the ghost family's cat. Officials pieced together the lie. The village lost its tax privileges for a decade. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining a quiet town at night, its alleys filled with silent names, names never called aloud, but always taxed. Ghosts without bodies, only debts. As dawn breaks, you step out of the records office. The city wakes slowly. Somewhere, a tax collector sharpens his brush. Somewhere else, a child learns to answer to a name that isn't hers, just to keep the ledger balanced. You breathe in the mist and wonder how many people across history were only ever real in ink. You board a narrow wooden boat, bobbing gently along a calm river, its hull creaking under the weight of grain sacks and bundled textiles. The air smells of wet reeds and warm fish, and somewhere upstream a cormorant splashes into the water. For a moment life seems simple, just you, the river, and the breeze. But as the boat drifts beneath a low stone bridge, you spot them tax collectors on a floating checkpoint. Flags fluttering, ledgers ready. Welcome to the world of boat taxes, where the size of your rudder, the shape of your sail, and even your cargo arrangement could determine how much silver you'd lose that day. You wave nervously and try to look like a humble ferryman, but it's no use. A bureaucrat leans out, scans the deck, and calls out, "Declare your cargo and vessel class." During the height of the Song dynasty's economic expansion, river trade exploded. Goods moved faster by boat than by road, and the waterways became the veins of the empire. And just like any body, the veins needed pressure regulators. Enter the river tax officials. Historians still argue whether boat taxes helped regulate trade fairly or just turned rivers into pay-to-play routes. Some regions had elaborate toll stations where boats had to stop, unload samples, register logs, and of course pay. Others charged based on volume, which led to hilarious innovations like hollow decks and disguised cargo. You peek over at a neighboring boat. It's carrying jars of pickled fish stacked under mats. But you've heard the trick, half the jars are fake. Underneath are bundles of silk, tax on pickled fish, modest, tax on luxury silk, painful. The inspector jabs one jar with a stick and shrugs. You hear a whisper from the other boatman, "Close one." Here's the fringe detail that might make you chuckle. Some taxes were based on the boat's width, not length. So clever traders built ridiculously long, skinny vessels that looked like water noodles, hard to steer, but wonderfully tax efficient. One famous example, nicknamed the Snake, was over 40 meters long, but barely wide enough to walk down the center. It capsized 3 times in a single week, but still turned a profit. You dock at a small river town where officials weigh goods on hanging bronze scales. There's a separate desk for grain, one for alcohol, and a strange third booth labeled miscellaneous irregularities. A merchant explains that's where they put things they don't understand or want to charge more for. And here's a juicy, quirky fact. Certain boats were taxed based on decoration. Have a carved dragon on your prow, taxed as elite merchant vessel. Use brightly dyed sails, taxed for imperial visibility. One poor man painted a lucky fish on his boat and was fined for advertising. You glance at your own vessel, plain and unassuming, and breathe a sigh of relief. Some dynasties tried to ease the burden. The Ming introduced floating tax zones where collectors could only operate in designated stretches, but enforcement was spotty and collectors often moved up or downstream, claiming they were in pursuit of evasive traffic. You can imagine the argument's angry captains tossing rice into the river just to avoid having it counted. As night falls, you tie your boat to a crooked tree and lie back on the deck. The stars ripple on the water's surface. Somewhere nearby, a trader sings an old lullaby, but it's interrupted by the dull clang of a gong, the checkpoint's closing bell. You're safe for now. But even in your sleep, you dream of tolls of ledges of narrow boats threading through loopholes like fish darting between nets, because in ancient China, even the river charged rent. You wrinkle your nose as you step through a side alley in a dense, teeming city district. The air is thick, warm, and earthy. You glance down at the cart, rolling slowly ahead of you, a wooden barrel sloshing with something dark and unspeakable. The man pulling it hums a tune unbothered. He's a night soil collector. And tonight you're following the trail of one of the strangest tax professions in all of Chinese history, the feces economy. Yes, you heard that right. Human waste wasn't just a byproduct of everyday life. It was a valuable commodity, traded, regulated, and naturally taxed. In a world without synthetic fertilizers, night soil, polite shorthand for collected human excrement, was liquid gold to farmers. Mixed with straw and compost, it fed fields, increased yields, and quite literally fueled the empire's rice bowls. That demand created an entire underground market, both figuratively and literally. You pass a row of outhouses, each marked with a tiny wooden tag. 1 string means private use. 2 strings means collection authorized. The collector you're shadowing stops at the 2-string house, unlatches the side chute, and empties a fresh load into his cart. His license dangles from his sash, stamped with the local magistrate's seal. That license wasn't cheap, and neither was the night soil tax. By the Tang dynasty, certain cities had introduced permits for feces collectors. Not just for hygiene, though that was the excuse, but as a form of revenue. The collectors paid a fee for the right to collect waste and then sold it to rural buyers. The price varied by season. Spring waste fetched the highest price because it fermented just in time for summer planting. Historians still argue whether this regulation was primarily for health or finance. Some scholars insist it improved sanitation. Others point out that once again the emperor's treasury conveniently benefited from the bowel movements of the population. Nothing like turning your morning routine into state profit. You crouch by a field just outside the city where barrels are being unloaded and carefully stirred into compost pits. A farmer grins. Better than silver, he says, because silver can't feed you. But don't get too romantic. This was also a job so stigmatized that families of night soil men were often barred from public office or marriage into clean families. Taxed, yes. Respected, not quite. And here's your fringe fact. In some cities, there were bidding wars for the richest neighborhoods. The waste of the wealthy was prized for its balanced diet and lower acidity, perfect for delicate crops. In Hangzhou, a legendary auction once erupted into a fistfight over rights to a street with imperial cousins. Imagine bidding not for land, but for their bathroom habits. You follow your guide through the winding streets as he stops at a shop to pay his dues, a modest tax collected nightly based on weight. There's even a balance scale. You think of all the tax categories we've covered, beards, windows, boats, and now realize that nothing, absolutely nothing escaped measurement, even the stuff people flushed away. Later dynasties tried to automate the process, creating government-run waste systems in capital cities. But the paperwork grew dense. One Ming record shows a minor rebellion sparked when an official changed the formula for acceptable collection moisture content. Too watery, no pay, too dry penalty. It got messy fast. One collector reportedly dried out his barrels with charcoal to boost weight and dodged the deduction. The result, a small explosion, a ruined road, and a permanent ban from the trade. There's even a joke recorded in a Qing manuscript. The clever man made his crap lighter. The wiser man made it official property. By the end of the Qing era, foreign observers were both horrified and impressed. One British trader wrote, In China, even excreta travels with a bill of lading. Romantic, no. Efficient, undeniably. You step aside as another cart rumbles past the moonlight, catching the gleam of a brass tax seal nailed to its handle. It swings gently, catching the breeze, and with it the scent of a civilization that knew how to monetize everything. You breathe through your mouth. Try not to think too hard, and keep walking. You arrive in a village square just as bells ring from the temple down the road. A procession of lanterns winds through the dusk, followed by laughter drums and a flash of red silk. Someone's getting married. You watch as the bride veiled in shimmering gauze is carried past in a sedan chair, her father tossing coins to children and her mother dabbing at tears. It's a joyful scene until you spot the tax officer lingering in the corner, brush and ledger in hand, watching the whole thing like a hawk in ceremonial robes. Because even love wasn't tax-free in ancient China. In fact, marriage itself could cost you dearly. You follow the scent of roasted chestnuts into a small tea stall, where the owner chuckles. You know what they say first. You pay the matchmaker, then the musician, then the magistrate, and he's not wrong. Marriage was a taxable milestone under various dynasties, particularly when it came to dowry, ceremony size, and official registration fees. The logic was simple. If you're wealthy enough to host a banquet for 200 guests and serve lotus wine, you're wealthy enough to fund a tiny slice of the local administration. The fancier the celebration, the steeper the charge. You walk past a scribe's booth where a young man is nervously filling out a marriage contract. Above him hangs a fee chart, paper fee, 2 copper coins. Name registration, 1 coin. Ceremonial surcharge bride wearing embroidered phoenix, 3 coins. Historians still argue whether these taxes were formalized state policy or opportunistic local levies. Some dynasties like the Han kept marriage taxes subtle, small processing fees mostly. Others, like the Yuan under Mongol rule, taxed heavily, viewing marriage as a socio-economic transaction, not a sacred union. In some regions, simply declaring a marriage to the village elder triggered a fee. If the couple skipped it and were later discovered, the penalties included retrospective taxation fines or even the nullification of the marriage in official eyes. Now here's the quirky bit. Weddings could become status performance traps. If you didn't host a large enough ceremony, your neighbors would whisper. But the larger the wedding, the higher the taxes. So many families built a public-facing charade, renting decorations, borrowing fine robes, and even hiring fake guests to clap and cheer without eating. A crowd meant social credit. The taxman didn't know who ate, or who just loitered politely. You follow the trail of celebration into a quieter alley, where a mother explains we had 2 weddings, one for the family, one for the tax officer. The second was small, silent, and entirely off the books. There were even bachelor taxes. During certain population crunches, like the early Qing period, single men above a certain age could be taxed as unmarried laborers under the logic that they weren't contributing to family lineage or future citizens. The term used idle stem tax. You sigh. Even being alone wasn't safe. In a dusty corner of a scholar's notebook from the Song dynasty, a marginal note reads, "Love is not free, ask any accountant." You imagine the quill pause, after that maybe a little smirk. Later in the evening, the groom stands at the door of the family home, holding a red paper seal, the official certificate. Without it, the marriage isn't recognized by the state. Without it, no tax record. And without that tax record, no dowry protections, no land inheritance, no legitimacy for children. You realize then that love, for all its poetry and promise, was meticulously catalogued by clerks in smoky offices. Its joys had to be registered, weighed, and filed. Even the union of 2 hearts required 3 signatures and a silver coin. As firecrackers crackle in the street and the wedding guests dance into the night, the tax officer finally steps away from the shadows and disappears into the dark. His work here is done. The bride and groom, they'll wake tomorrow as husband and wife, and as new entries in the empire's ledger. You wander through the pale morning light into a serene courtyard, swept clean and echoing with soft chanting. Incense drifts lazily in the air, curling around the carved beams of a Buddhist temple. A gong sounds. A row of monks in saffron robes walk silently past you, eyes low, hands folded. Peaceful, sacred, untouchable, not quite. Because even here, within these walls of stillness and prayer, the imperial taxman found a way in. You ease yourself onto a stone bench, watching a temple steward tally offerings at a lacquered wooden desk. A heavy register lies open, rows upon rows of names, dates, and coin amounts. This isn't just a spiritual refuge, it's a financial hub, and you've just stepped into the surprisingly taxable world of religious institutions in ancient China. Temples were theoretically exempt from many taxes. In fact, under certain dynasties, like the early Tang monks and nuns, enjoyed legal status as non-taxable persons, free from labor conscription, land levies, and household taxes. It was seen as a sign of moral support from the throne. The emperor honored the divine, and in return the divine endorsed the emperor. But as temples grew richer, their land holdings expanded, their influence deepened, and the taxmen grew curious. Historians still argue whether the religious tax exemptions helped spiritual growth or simply created vast loopholes for the elite. Many wealthy families began donating land to temples, not for piety, but to dodge taxes. A noble might gift a rice paddy to a monastery, then quietly continue harvesting its profits through a friendly monk. The term for this false donation lands. You step into a quiet library where an elderly monk is transcribing sutras. On the floor beside him sits a jar of coins labeled Grain Permit Fund. When you ask, he smiles and explains, "We pay a little to keep the fields clean." A poetic way of admitting the temple is taxed unofficially. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some temples started charging entry fees for pilgrims, not just for donation, but to fund their own taxation needs. One shrine even posted a sign, "Enlightenment is free, maintenance is not." Charming, right? As dynasties changed, so did the rules. During the Yuan dynasty, Mongol rulers, less bound by Chinese spiritual customs, aggressively taxed Buddhist institutions, even seizing temple gold for military campaigns. Meanwhile, Taoist temples were favored by other courts and enjoyed longer periods of fiscal forgiveness. The result, a subtle rivalry between faiths, played out not in scripture but in spreadsheets. You duck into a side hall where statues of bodhisattvas stare calmly forward. Their pedestals are carved with donor names and donation amounts. You realize now that even holiness needed funding, and funding needed to be tracked. By the Ming era, things got even stranger. Some local governments created monk quotas. If a temple had too many monks, it risked fines. The idea was to prevent lazy men from avoiding tax labor by shaving their heads and joining monasteries. So temples began secretly rotating robes where the same garment was worn by multiple men during inspections to make the population seem smaller. Talk about spiritual efficiency. And here's a fringe historical twist. In one coastal region, monks were taxed not in coin, but in meditation hours. They were required to chant for the emperor's well-being and keep logs signed by senior monks that were then submitted monthly. If they must be free, one official wrote, "Let them at least pray productively." You sit in the temple garden, watching koi circle lazily in a stone basin. It's quiet here, deceptively simple. But beneath this calm is a balancing act, a tug-of-war between piety and paperwork. The monks chant the incense burns, and somewhere in the back room, someone tallies how much enlightenment costs per square foot. As you leave, a bell chimes behind you. A final reminder that even in sacred spaces, the empire always kept its ear pressed against the bamboo walls. You find yourself at the bustling edge of a port city, Fuzhou perhaps, or Canton, where sails bob like dragon scales on the horizon, and every language seems to echo through the docks. Traders unload silk spices, pearls, and crates of tea, shouting orders through clouds of steam and gull feathers. But amid the chaos stands a familiar figure, a government official in neat robes, flanked by guards, and carrying a weighing scale. Because in ancient China, foreign trade wasn't just a diplomatic curiosity, it was a taxable gold mine. And being labeled a foreigner came with a unique price tag. You follow a group of Persian merchants lugging carved jade and fragrant woods toward the customs office. The clerk barely looks up. He's seen it all before. He stamps their ledgers and gestures to a row of chests, each one marked with a symbol silk, incense, silver. They not understanding that before anything can be sold, the barbarian tariff must be paid. Yes, that's what it was often called, Huren Shui, the foreigner's tax. The term sounds harsh today, but at the time it was standard bureaucratic language, and it wasn't personal, it was policy. The Tang and Song dynasties both regulated foreign trade through taxed trading ports where outsiders could do business only in specific quarters at specific times under the watchful eye of the state. This wasn't just about control, it was about revenue extraction, and the empire excelled at it. Historians still argue whether these taxes were purely economic or served a subtle political containment. After all, by herding foreign traders into walled-off districts, the state could both benefit from their goods and minimize cultural contamination, control the flow, control the influence. But it wasn't always antagonistic. In fact, many foreign traders preferred it. The predictability of imperial tax policy meant that if you paid your dues and followed the rules, you could trade safely, even prosperously. Some Persian and Arab merchants made fortunes under the Tang, operating legal shops and marrying into local families. A few even converted to Chinese customs, adopted Han names, and were eventually exempted from certain taxes. Paperwork was powerful. Here's a quirky anecdote. During the Ming Dynasty, one Japanese trader was fined twice, once for docking early, and once again because his parrot spoke too loudly, disturbing a magistrate's rest. The record notes the bird cried in foreign speech. No tribute was attached. Fine 4 silver coins. You watch a Vietnamese trader haggle over a shipment of lacquerware. He gestures to a missing box, claiming it was damaged in transit. The tax officer sighs, then levies a partial transit waiver. The system had its own language of fairness, just deeply buried under layers of bamboo slips and seal stamps. Another layer, cultural taxes. Some regions imposed duties based on goods considered exotic or culturally decadent. Incense from India, taxed as a luxury scent. Spices like cinnamon and pepper, taxed not for nutrition, but for status aroma. It was an aesthetic tax built on assumptions about foreign excess. As you wander through the merchant quarter, you notice something subtle. Many shops are fronted by locals, but owned by foreigners behind the scenes. A workaround. These proxy systems allowed merchants to dodge the outsider rate and instead pay standard market tax. Clever, definitely. Legal, dubious, but common extremely. And here's the fringe detail under certain dynasties. Foreign ships were taxed based on sail shape. If your mast curved upward in a dragon tail style seen as auspicious, you paid less. Flat-sailed ships taxed more, seen as unlucky. That's what happens when superstition collides with bureaucracy. You pass through the port gate and notice a final sign. All foreign goods must be weighed before sold. All foreign words must be written before spoken. The second rule's ambiguous, perhaps a warning, perhaps a riddle. As the sun sets, you gaze at the ships rocking gently in the bay. They've crossed seas, storms and strange customs only to be measured, taxed and sorted by ink and brush. And yet they keep coming. Because even when the rules were strange, and the fees high, trade with the Middle Kingdom was worth it. The silk flowed, the silver sparkled, and the ledgers grew thicker day by golden day. The wind turns colder as you wander from the noisy markets toward a quiet hillside dotted with ancient tombstones. The city fades behind you, no more tax officers, no shouting merchants. Just earthstone and silence. But if you thought death exempted you from taxation, think again, because here even tombs were taxable. You kneel beside a crumbling grave marker, its inscription worn by centuries of rain. A paper slip is tucked beneath a loose tile, faded red ink, declaring a burial fee paid. It's not a prank. It's policy. For much of Chinese imperial history, dying wasn't free. Back in the Han Dynasty, the state began charging burial taxes. It started modestly, a small fee to register a gravesite. Over time, that expanded into a full fiscal category. You died, your family paid. For the coffin, for the plot, for the priest, for the recording of your name in official registries, And yes, for the tomb itself, especially if it was built with any hint of style. You pass a stone carver's stall just outside the cemetery. He's chiseling a phoenix onto a headstone. Do you want the wings curved, he asks. It'll cost extra, but it'll also increase your tax bracket. Wait, what? Turns out decorative elements on tombs like animal sculptures or inscriptions could bump your family into a higher tax tier. More carvings meant more wealth assumed. And assumed wealth, that meant higher fees. Sometimes families would bury decorative pieces inside the tomb to hide them from inspectors. A rich interior, a humble face, as one Ming proverb goes. Historians still argue whether these death taxes were a way to control land use or simply another clever revenue stream. Some believe taxing graves helped the state track population growth even posthumously. Others see it as a symbolic gesture reminding citizens that the emperor's reach extended beyond life. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, people paid a spiritual maintenance fee. Officially, this was meant to fund temple upkeep and ancestral prayer ceremonies. Unofficially, it was a bribe to make sure your grave wouldn't be moved or worse, reused. Yes, reuse. Grave plots weren't always permanent. In densely populated areas, if taxes weren't paid regularly, officials had the legal right to excavate remains and repurpose the site. There are imperial edicts on record authorizing corpse dislodgement due to delinquency. That's bureaucracy at its most existential. You walk deeper into the graveyard, where a wealthy merchant's tomb rises above the rest stone lions, guarding the gate poetry etched in gold leaf. It's beautiful. It also likely cost more than some houses. But his family didn't just pay for materials, they paid for protection from reclassification. The larger the tomb, the more officials assumed you could pay to keep it untouched. Ironically, modest graves were more at risk. Later dynasties introduced death certificates, not just to record the departed, but to confirm that burial taxes had been properly settled. No receipt, no rest. In some cases, burial was postponed until taxes cleared. Imagine grieving your loved one and also negotiating with a tax clerk who insists the urn needs a registry seal. And here's the fringe fact that still baffles scholars. During a drought in the Yuan dynasty, officials briefly proposed a grave tax holiday to stimulate morale, essentially encouraging people to die in that year to avoid fees. The idea didn't last. But the records exist scribbled awkwardly into policy scrolls no one quite believed. You sit beneath a tree and watch the sun sink behind the tombstones. The silence here isn't truly silent. It hums with ledger ink, with ghostly entries in bamboo archives, with copper coins tucked into funeral robes. A life ended, but not without paperwork. As night falls, you light a small lantern and trace the shape of a forgotten headstone. The name is faded, but beside it, in deeper etching, remains a clear mark, tax cleared year of the ox. Even the dead need receipts. You brush aside a curtain of bamboo stalks and step into a dusty granary, the scent of old husks and dry soil heavy in the air. Towering piles of woven sacks lean against wooden beams, each sack bulging with what seems to be the same thing, rice. But as you get closer, you notice the sacks are not uniform. Some are marked with inked seals, some are suspiciously lumpy, and some are twitching. Congratulations! You've just entered the world of grain taxation, where rice rats and ledgers collided in bizarre and bureaucratic harmony. In ancient China, rice wasn't just food, it was currency. Dynasties like the Han Tang and Ming collected enormous portions of their tax revenue in kind, meaning instead of silver or copper, peasants delivered grain, often rice, wheat or millet. The logic was simple: what you grow is what you owe. You lean against a pillar as a tax inspector stabs a bamboo stick into a random sack. Out comes not just rice, but a tiny rat that scurries away with half a grain stuck to its nose. The inspector frowns. "Spoiled batch," he says. 30% penalty. Because yes, not all rice was equal. Taxes weren't just collected based on weight, but quality, purity, and vermin levels. If your batch had too much husk, too many broken grains, or even a whiff of mildew the taxman deducted from your quota, or worse, fined you for trying to pass off bad product. Historians still argue whether this system was fair or impossible. For many peasants, it felt like a trap. The better your harvest, the more they took. The worse your grain, the more you owed. And those caught cheating by watering grain to increase weight or padding sacks with dirt were punished not just with fines but public shaming. You crouch beside a farmer, repacking his sack after inspection. He whispers, "You know the trick. Boil the rice dry. It fast makes it heavier. Just don't let it smell." He smiles, then frowns. "Last week my cousin's batch fermented. The rats got drunk. Inspectors said it was spiritual contamination." And here's your quirky tidbit. Some regions actually recorded rats as part of the inventory. If you submitted too many rodent-infested sacks, your village might be declared grain compromised, resulting in higher regional quotas the next year. One record from the Southern Song describes a frantic festival where villagers appeased the rice gods with fake offerings, really just a last-ditch prayer to lower the vermin count before tax day. Later dynasties tried to modernize the system. The Qing introduced sealed bamboo measuring tubes and rotating inspection teams. Still, corruption thrived. Bribes in the form of fermented rice cakes, known jokingly as inspectors' mooncakes, were common during harvest season. You pass another storage area and notice odd bundles hanging from the rafters, taxed grain tied with colored string. Red string meant high grade, yellow average, black spoiled but still counted. One official even used scented oil to mask spoiled grain and sneak it past his superior. It worked for one season. Then a regional rebellion broke out over grain shortages, and the scented sacks were blamed for hiding the truth. And here's the fringe detail. Some tax officers kept pet rats, well-fed, tame, and allegedly used for training. But some scholars believe the rats were released strategically into rival villages' stores to sabotage quotas and inflate penalties. Weaponized rodents, ancient tax espionage. As the sun slants through the slats in the granary wall, you hear the rhythmic sound of rice being scooped, weighed, sealed. Over and over. A nation of farmers moving grain from soil to sack to scroll. One mistake, one rat, one rotten husk, and your year's labor vanishes into debt. You look down at a single grain of rice. So small, so weightless. Yet multiplied by thousands, it carries the full weight of empire. You brush it from your sleeve, the floor squeaks. Was that a rat? You step out of the granary into the fading afternoon light, where villagers gather in a circle speaking in hushed tones. Someone passes a folded parchment hand to hand, eyes scanning it quickly, furtively, before tucking it into a sleeve. It's not a wanted poster or an imperial edict. It's a loophole list. Because when taxes tighten, creativity thrives. Tonight you enter the murky but often hilarious world of tax avoidance and rebellion, where everyday people used whitlock and the occasional donkey costume to keep their silver where it belonged. You settle on a low stone wall beside a potter polishing clay jugs. They tax the jug's mouth, now he grumbles, as if a bigger sip means a richer soul. He pulls out a jug, with a false neck narrower than it appears, a quiet rebellion in ceramic. Throughout Chinese history, peasant uprisings over taxes were common, but far more frequent and far funnier were the evasion strategies used by common folk to dodge the system without risking open defiance. Here's the first classic name swapping. Families would rotate identities, passing the official tax burden from son to uncle to cousin to imaginary brother-in-law. The result, inspectors would find the same man living in 5 different houses across 3 districts. He's very committed, one clerk wrote sarcastically. Then there was land fragmentation. If owning more land meant more tax, just split your land across multiple fake owners. A single rice field might be owned by 15 different names on paper, each just under the threshold. Inspectors would have to chase ghosts through the countryside, tripping over oxen and contradictory maps. Historians still argue whether the state truly believed these deceptions or simply tolerated them in small doses to avoid unrest. Some dynasties even issued vague warnings like "let small frauds lie where they do no harm." which sounds a lot like bureaucratic surrender. You stroll past a weaving shop where the looms are oddly shaped, extra narrow, slightly tilted. Why? Because the tax code listed number of standard width looms as a revenue base. So clever artisans made non-standard looms that couldn't be taxed under the existing rules. The silk came out crooked, the taxes didn't. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. During a brief period in the early Ming, there was a tax on male donkeys used for transport. To dodge it, traders began dressing their donkeys as females, complete with silk veils and flower-painted saddles. Inspectors weren't allowed to check too closely, dignity and all, so the illusion worked. One record, Riley notes, this year the province birthed 2,000 lovely she-donkeys. Miraculous. Then there's spiritual avoidance. When temple land became tax-exempt, whole communities converted their fields to sacred rice. Statues were buried at the borders and locals staged mock ceremonies. Offerings were made, one inspector complained, but not to the treasury. And the fringe trick, seasonal vanishing. In harsh years, villagers would pack up just before the tax survey and migrate temporarily to neighboring districts, leaving their homes looking abandoned. Some even placed withered reeds in their roofs to simulate disrepair. Inspectors would mark them ruined and unproductive. A month later, the families returned quietly, gratefully, still untaxed. You share a bowl of millet wine with an old woman who boasts she once disguised her rice barn as a bathhouse. They taxed grain, she says with a grin, not steam. But it wasn't all harmless fun. Sometimes evasions grew into movements. Secret societies formed to train people in tax avoidance, creating coded manuals and shared escape routes. When one group was discovered, they responded by planting wildflowers over their fields, claiming they were philosophical gardens. The court didn't laugh. As the stars rise, you join a small crowd, watching shadow puppets in the village square. The story: a greedy magistrate who chokes on coins while trying to tax a rooster's crow. The children laugh, but the adults nod too knowingly. You realize now that behind every clever workaround was something more profound: resistance, not through weapons, but through wit. The empire had its scrolls, but the people had workarounds etched in rice paper and rumor. The wind picks up. A parchment floats by your foot, half a map, half a tax form, modified beyond recognition. You pick it up, tuck it away. After all, you never know when you'll need a good loophole. You step into a quiet room tucked behind the village registry, its walls lined with bamboo scrolls, some sealed, some cracked open, their fibers curled from age and candle smoke. The air here is dense with silence, not religious silence, but bureaucratic stillness. It's the sound of thousands of recorded transactions, settled debts, unpaid fines, and 1,000 tiny lives etched in careful brushstrokes. Welcome to the final chapter of tonight's journey, the birth of tax receipts, or as one early Ming accountant called them, the sleeping dragon of governance. You sit cross-legged beside a low desk, where a clerk dips a brush into thick black ink and begins to write. Not a poem, not a law, but something far more powerful: proof. Because in ancient China, tax wasn't truly paid until it was acknowledged. And that acknowledgement, the tax receipt, was your only shield from the gears of the empire grinding again. Early receipts were crude, knotted ropes, tallies carved into bamboo, or stamped bits of parchment bearing your name, the amount paid, and the item taxed. Lose one, and you could be taxed again. The state's memory was long. Yours had better be longer. Historians still argue whether these systems emerged purely for record-keeping, or also served to instill psychological obedience. A tangible receipt was a physical reminder of your place in the imperial order. It was more than paper. It was a contract of silence. You've paid, so don't speak up again. You leaf through a scroll listing registered taxpayers. Some names are marked with red seals, others with slashes across their entries. Those slashes death, or disappearance, or relocation. The system never clarified. All that mattered was the number beside your name and whether it had been scratched off or doubled. And here's your quirky tidbit: during the Song dynasty, one official introduced scented ink to prevent fraud. The receipts smelled faintly of plum blossoms, so you could tell if someone forged one with ordinary dye. Brilliant. Also mildly absurd. But it worked at least for a season or two. You wander into a side room filled with tax boxes, wooden compartments, where villagers submitted silver coins, wrapped in cloth, with their names tied on with red thread. The box would be sealed, carried to the capital, and opened weeks later. Inside payments, yes. But also notes, messages, pleas, jokes. One clerk famously read a scroll that said, "This is my last coin. If you tax my dog, next tell him to bite you." The clerk laughed. The coin was accepted. Later dynasties introduced more refined systems. Chopped seals, carbon copies on silk, even double verification teams to issue joint receipts. The complexity increased, but so did the weight of trust behind each document. For the average citizen, a stamped paper could mean the difference between being seen as loyal or being dragged into court for tax evasion. And the fringe fact to end our tale. During one unusually snowy winter in the north, entire tax archives were frozen solid inside a collapsed temple. When spring thawed, the scribes discovered the moisture had warped the bamboo slips. Receipts didn't match. Chaos ensued. People were taxed again. Others weren't taxed at all. And from that chaos rose the first imperial discussion of data backup. A Tang official solemnly wrote, "Let not the dragon sleep on only one pillow." You smile as you imagine a tired bureaucrat saying that out loud, rubbing his temples. Now as the candlelight flickers low, you unroll one final scroll. It's blank, waiting for your name. You take the brush, dip it in ink, sign your mark. You've made it to the end of the ledger. The night deepens now, and the pages of history close gently around us like the shutters of an old wooden home. You've walked the dusty roads of ancient villages, peeked into crooked rooftops, smelled the rice, the incense, the ink, and felt the heavy hand of a world that taxed not only the riches of its people, but their light, their love, even their silence. And yet in all its absurdity, there's something comforting about the rhythm of it all. The salt, and the paper, the boat, and the beard, the rat, and the rice, all part of an old empire's heartbeat. It reminds you that even the grandest dynasties were built on the tiniest things: a grain of rice, a folded receipt, a whispered joke about donkeys. So now you can let go. Let the ships drift. Let the ink dry. Let the scrolls be sealed. The taxman's lantern has dimmed and the ledger is closed for tonight. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. Nothing is owed now. No stamps, no signatures, just quiet. If you've made it this far, I hope this strange little journey helped you find stillness at the edge of history. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Drop your time and location below. And if you enjoy these slow dives into forgotten corners of the past, remember to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now roll onto your side, loosen your jaw, and drift gently down into dreams, where no one checks the windows and your beard grows tax-free.